The US recently hit Canada with tariffs, accusing us of fueling their fentanyl crisis. Ottawa has fired back, insisting that we barely are a factor, pointing to just 43 pounds of fentanyl seized at the US Canada border in 2024, a fraction of the 21,000 pounds coming from Mexico. Now, that's the mainstream media narrative, and at first glance, it makes Trump's accusations look ridiculous. But that 43-pound stat, well, it's kind of a joke. It only counts what gets caught at the longest and most undefended border in the world, not what actually makes it through. The real scale of Canada's role in this crisis is far more significant. 80 to 90% of fentanyl hitting our streets starts with precursor chemicals coming from China. From there, transnational crime syndicates like the Chinese triads and Mexican cartels turn it into fentanyl, where it's cut into deadly doses. After that, it pours into American cities or back into Canadian communities. And Ontario's trucking boom has played a major role in its distribution. Truck driving schools have increased by 350% over the last 5 years, and they are packed with international students operating with little to no oversight. Many of these students, who are linked to transnational crime groups, get licensed, move shipments across borders, and face almost no scrutiny. And this isn't speculation. It's a known smuggling loophole, so that 43-pound figure is nothing compared to what's actually being shipped. 2 months ago, Saskatchewan RCMP busted 17 pounds of fentanyl in a single truck. 4 months ago, BC police raided a super lab, uncovering 119 pounds of fentanyl ready for distribution. It's worth noting that a super lab has the capacity to produce thousands of pounds of fentanyl every year. Meanwhile, the U.S. continues catching major shipments linked to Canadian networks, including 211 pounds of cocaine in Montana, 1,146 pounds of cocaine in Illinois, and over 1,700 pounds of methamphetamines and cocaine moving through California. These aren't minor busts, and they prove that large-scale trafficking is happening inside our borders. And for those unfamiliar, this is no joke. Fentanyl is killing between 75 and 100,000 people every year in Canada and the United States. In fact, it's the leading cause of death for adults aged 18 to 45 in America. And in my opinion, this isn't just an overdose crisis. It's chemical warfare. China knows exactly what it's doing. Hell, we even negotiate with them to cut production, but they have continually refused. What's insane is that we don't even know how much fentanyl is leaving Canada. RCMP officer Matthew Bertrand admitted Canada is a significant fentanyl exporter, but he couldn't even guess how bad it is because our system is so full of holes. And a prime example of that is our border. The near 9,000-kilometer US-Canada border has just 2,200 agents. That's one for every 4 kilometers. With only 121 official ports of entry, about 98% of the border has no fixed checkpoints, which is why it is historically known as the longest undefended border. In fact, a Congressional Research Service report pegged operational control at just 115 kilometers. 115 of 9,000 kilometers. No wonder this is a problem, Canada. Meanwhile, the 3,100-kilometer US-Mexico border has 16,500 agents, or 1 per 0.2 kilometers, with fences, patrols, and tighter controls. This means it's 20 times more guarded than the Canadian border. So, is Trump wrong to slap tariffs on us? Maybe. But the real problem here isn't Trump. It's Canada's negligence. Under 10 years of Liberal rule, we've become a key hub for fentanyl production and trafficking. Our loose immigration policies let transnational gangs flourish, while Trudeau's soft-on-crime approach emboldened criminals across the nation. So the question isn't whether U.S. should be punishing Canada, it's whether Canada will wake up and fix this mess before it gets even worse. Today, I'm joined by Liam DeBoer. He's a cultural commentator, writer, and reporter with Blendr News. Liam, thanks for being here.
Looking forward to chatting. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we hear a lot about fentanyl coming in from Mexico, but less about Canada's role. Can you break down how Canada actually fits into this crisis in about a minute and a half?
So production and distribution is a large aspect, definitely within Canada. Anybody trying to downplay that is definitely doing so for their own benefit, mainly our political class. However, the main function of Canada within this is financial. So we are a money laundering hub. We've become internationally famous for being an international money laundering hub. So the way that this works is businessmen from China will use the Chinese narcos to get their money out of China, and in return, the narcos end up getting their money back into China. It's a very sophisticated process, but the way it works is essentially the businessman gives cash to Chinese narcos in China, and then that businessman flies to a place like Vancouver, and that Chinese narco then hands him a duffel bag full of cash, which are often money made from drug profits. And then that businessman cleans that money through our casinos and it then ends up into our banking systems. This is where you see the TD Bank getting hit with these money laundering cases. So the main thing that Canada is involved in is money laundering. And then also we serve as a base for operations. If you look at the very large players in this game, for instance, Chi Lop.
I'm going to pause you right there, and we're going to finish the story when we get back. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show. We're just going to pick up right where we left off. Go.
So when it comes to Canada, you also see the big players in this game operating out of Canada. So a notable figure is Chi Lop, who is dubbed Asia's El Chapo, makes ridiculous amounts of money. The organizations that he oversees, we're talking about $8 billion annually. And so they come here and they operate out of here because of our lax laws. So he moved here in 1988. He ended up getting arrested in Hong Kong and extradited to America for charges. After he was released from that, he moved right back to Canada and ended up living in Markham for about a decade before he was then later arrested in Amsterdam in 2021. So there's a lot of these guys like him who are at the top of the game that can operate in Canada seemingly without any law enforcement getting on them.
With impunity, it seems like.
And then everywhere else they go in the world, they get arrested. So
right. So we're not just harboring them. We're facilitating it through the lax system we have, both in economics and at the border and with our lax crime laws. Okay, so a question I want to ask you about this 43 pounds of fentanyl. We know that this is incorrect, but why is that number so misleading?
Well, just because even right at it, right? 43 pounds of fentanyl at the border. That's a very small location when you're factoring in.
Yeah, at a very big border that's very open.
Exactly. And so even a lot of the numbers that you rattled off in the opening monologue of this episode, you can see that all of those happen deep into the States or in Canada as well. That's not ever going to be put on the spreadsheet of what gets seized at the border.
Right.
So yeah, it's definitely just a misleading number off the hop.
Got it. So I want to jump into how these networks all work together. So how do transnational gangs, whether the triads or the cartels or others, which we know are involved, how do they work together to actually move fentanyl through Canada and into the United States?
Well, if you think about crime as just any other business, you know, if you have a business in a certain sector, maybe you need a supplier for a certain product.
Yeah.
And so if you think about the Sinaloa cartel and other Mexican gangs, we actually have 4,000 different organized crime groups in Canada right now.
4,000?
4,000. The RCMP has stated this in a commission themselves.
Wow.
So those different groups, they need the products to make these drugs that they then sell. And so a lot of the precursor chemicals are actually getting shipped in through massive companies and such that are based out of China. They bring the raw materials into China, and then those groups like, say, the Sinaloa cartel or even these smaller groups then buy those chemicals, make wholesale, and then make the product here.
And then once the product's made, how is it getting everywhere?
Well, it seems like our trucking industry is definitely playing a part in that. As you pointed out, the regulations within our trucking industry have been shattered over the last few years, and the amount of schools popping up. So even, for instance, there are teachers at these schools that don't have the proper requirements that for them to give people the driver's license that they need for trucks.
Right.
But they're doing it anyways. So it's essentially a pay to play. If you think about that as a international crime group, well, if I need a distribution process, you can just pay for your foot soldiers to go there. We'll pay for the credit for this school. You don't even need the time essentially because it's a completely fabricated piece of paper. But then, yeah, you can just pay to play your whole way through the trucking process.
Okay, so we know China's making the precursors. We know that Mexico is involved in finishing the process, let's say, and shipping. And now we've got, it seems, Ontario, their trucking laws. They're making it very easy for the distribution process. Why would they be doing this?
Well, I mean, it depends which way you want to go on that question. Some of it, I think there isn't really like an overall they. For instance, different people have different incentives. So some people within our political class just have an incentive to pretend like the problem doesn't exist because it would look bad on them. They would have a hard time getting votes in the next election if it came out that they allowed this problem to fester. However, I do believe that there are people in our political class that are directly tied into this and profit off of it as well. So, for instance, there's a famous scandal of the Liberal MP Randy Bosno. He was tied to a company called Global Health Imports, which was owned by Steven Anderson, and they shared an address, that business shared an address with Francesca LeBlond, who has been detained twice for international drug smuggling. Most recently, she was caught with 420 pounds of cocaine in a private jet.
Right.
And so you have these intertwined people, and so I think it benefits them all at the same time.
So it's either they're trying to do the right thing, virtue signaling, or there's something in it for them.
Yeah,
okay.
Everyone's different.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. So we're starting to understand the fentanyl crisis in Canada, but let's dig a little deeper. Okay, Liam, earlier we were talking about China, but it's become very clear that they're the head of the snake. Can you maybe dig a little deeper and tell me how they benefit from all this?
So if you think about nations as countries as businesses,
yes.
Then anytime that you're in a negotiation with another business, you're looking for leverage, right? And I think we can actually look at a historical example of exactly what's happening here, which was the Opium Wars in the 19th century, where the British used opium to destabilize China, and then they used that to actually gain leverage to get more access to their ports and their economies.
Right.
They used the opium to destabilize their society so that they'd become less economically productive, and they would then be reliant on foreign economies. And so China to me, it looks like is just using the exact same blueprint that was used against them 200 years ago on us. And so, I think it's just leverage.
Yeah, so that's saying is history repeats itself, right?
Right.
And it's interesting. So they've not only used that as leverage, but now they've infiltrated so many different areas of our nation and of our economy. So I just want to shift gears to Canada and sort of our government's involvement in this. So whether policy negligence or willful blindness, how has the federal government contributed to this crisis?
Well, definitely through the mass migration policies that have been in place for the last few years. We had on our temporary foreign worker program, which was vastly expanded, they also were taking away guardrails, telling them not to screen for fraud in those anymore. And so it became very easy for people to come into our country. And then also you pair that with the soft on crime laws, taking away mandatory minimum sentencing, the reform on bails, people can get out on the street the next day. It's extremely easy. There's essentially no cost. When you look at crime, organized crime, a lot of the times when they look at these avenues, whether it be, am I going to get into car theft? Am I going to get into dealing fentanyl? They will weigh the penalties as a cost of business. Well, if I go down this route, I might face this cost. So therefore, the potential benefits aren't worth it. I'm not going to go down that road. And so when we have this system where we've been taking away all of those penalties, then it's open season.
So basically lax crime laws and open immigration has been the biggest contributor.
For sure.
So what's stopping Canada from cracking down on this problem? Is it corruption? Is it incompetence? Or is it something worse?
Well, I think, again, it depends on each individual that you're talking about within the sphere. However, I think there are a lot of people that have, especially within our political class, for instance, our new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, he is deeply economically intertwined with China, with real estate and green energy projects, and also even with Chinese state-owned banks, has hundreds of millions of dollars in loans through them. And so if you look at that, it's not even whether, say, somebody like him would have to directly benefit from the crime in Canada, but maybe if he cracks down on it, then China goes, you know what, we're not going to allow you as much access to our markets anymore, and it's a return cost. And so it's just, if I look the other way on this, I can still go full steam ahead with business in China.
So you think more than anything, it's just there's a mutual interest in allowing this to continue, really, right? So it's interesting. Earlier you pointed out, the opium crisis in the 19th century Now, back then, we had more nationalism. Countries really worried about themselves. Sure, they were expanding, but they worried about themselves. But would you agree or would you disagree that we now live in a time, because of globalism and global trade, and how easy you can convince maybe one leader to be sympathetic to your cause, that that's actually a much more effective strategy in today's day and age?
Yeah, and I think we definitely get taken advantage of, because even, I can see the appeal in this idea of a world that cooperates together and,
Sure.
takes the idea of, a world without borders. It sounds very pleasant, right? But then, okay, even if you have that position and that's what you want to work towards, it doesn't mean that other people will. And so we've seen this with China, for instance, is they'll say, yes, let's open up international cooperation, more trade, more development. But we allow them into the Canadian market in greater ways than they allow us into the Chinese market. There's
Right.
more. So it's not necessarily actually free. We're taking down our defenses, allowing them in more, while also simultaneously not getting the same thing in return.
Would you argue that's because Canada doesn't have that much to offer right now?
Yeah, it's leverage in all of these, right? And just like we were talking about earlier, well, if they can make our society less productive economically, then we have less economic leverage to use against them in negotiations.
One big circus. Okay, guys, we'll be right back. Welcome back to the show. Now that we have a much better understanding of the fentanyl crisis, let's discuss the consequences and what's next for Canada. So, Liam, Trump has used fentanyl and this crisis with immigration to justify his tariffs on Canada. Does he have information that we don't have that maybe says this quantity is much larger and we're a much bigger part of this problem?
I don't even think it's just that Trump has this information, but America in general has had this information for decades. So if you look back to the Sidewinder report, which happened 2 decades ago, where even Canadian law enforcement detailed exactly how this all works through Chinese narco groups, business tycoons, and the CCP all being linked. And then there was also a project called Operation Dragonlord by American law enforcement in the 1990s, which was a report that detailed out the same thing. And again, so for decades, we've had this information. We know that this is happening, but we have a political class that is seemingly benefiting from at least ignoring the problem.
So it sounds like they know that there's a lot more going on, essentially.
Right.
So do you think that his tariffs are justified to curb the drug trade and the illegal immigration we're suffering from?
Well, it's a tool. And so I think the war on this infiltration of narco groups and the mass expansion of organized crime in North America is justified 100%. Whether the tariffs are the best tool for that,
Right.
I don't know. But when it comes to the debate, people don't ever offer a different scenario as to how to fight these sorts of things, right? You typically have 2 levers as a country, which is economic or military.
Right.
And so I think he's justified in wanting to shut down this network. But if you don't want him to use economic force, then you're asking for him to use. And so I go, maybe we should be okay with this. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm kind of on the fence too. It seems like I'm not sure that there's a better strategy that exists, right? So no, I'm on the same page. So what steps should Canada take to avoid further backlash from the U.S.? And how can we restore trust in our border security and anti-trafficking efforts?
At the end of the day, it's really just going to be having a political class in Canada that isn't so intertwined with China. I believe that when it comes to Trump, he's trying to reestablish American dominance on the global stage, and he has seen that transferring over to China over the last few decades. And I think he wants to put an end to that. And this is just one of the ways that he's going to do that. But as long as we continue to have a political class that is deeply intertwined with China, whether it be Carney through real estate and green deals, whether it be Charest through Huawei, he was taking money from Huawei, you see all of these things. So as long as that is our political class, I think he'll continue to see us as an enemy.
Okay, so what would a real crackdown on fentanyl in Canada actually look like?
Definitely at the ports. And one of the main things that we struggle with in Canada is not having the actual tools for law enforcement to do these things.
Right.
So we don't even have a RICO Act, which would allow you to try people within a criminal network. So you wouldn't have to get individual cases against each person and take them to court separately. if we had something mirroring America's RICO laws, we could essentially try them as an organization. But we don't have that. And so I think we need to desperately look at what are the political tools that we can give law enforcement to make them more effective in that battle.
Right. And what did you think about, sort of our trucking networks and maybe the immigration side as well?
Well, I think overall, Canada definitely needs to change its tune on the waves of immigration that we've had. For decades, we had a working immigration system. It was benefiting the country. It was bringing economic success. However, what we've done over the last 5 to 10 years is completely different than our historical immigration policies. And yeah, so I think we definitely need to rethink those as well. When you look at, even there was a recent article posted by the National Post, which showed that Canada has become a place for crime vacations, where organized crime will look at it and be like, oh, the sun goes down in winters, and so and it gets darker quicker, gives us greater access. We won't face penalties. So yeah.
It's policy across the board. Immigration, obviously the trucking issue, harder on crime, and we got to change a few things here to really get to get ourselves back on track. Liam, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate your time. As the U.S. ramps up pressure with tariffs and accusations, Canada can no longer ignore its role in the fentanyl crisis. This isn't just a trade issue, it's a national security problem, one that affects lives on both sides of the border. The question is, will our government step up and stop the smuggling, clamp down on organized crime, and protect Canadians from the deadly impact of this epidemic? Or will we continue to let political games and negligence drive us deeper into a crisis with our most important trading partner? Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week on Outspoken.